Okay, I'm here with Kourtney Mitchell, and my name is Max Wilbert, and I'm an organizer with Deep Green Resistance and a number of other groups working on a variety of issues. And Kourtney has been kind enough to join me here today to speak about the connections between environmentalism and the anti-war movement. Kourtney, would you mind introducing yourself and who you are for a minute?
Yes. Thanks for having me, Max. It's great to talk with you. I'm my last name is now Andar. Actually, I'm Kourtney Andar,
Right.
and I am a writer and an activist. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I am a member of Deep Green Resistance, and also on the board of directors of nonprofit called Veterans for Peace, which is a veterans anti-war organization. I'm just happy to be here.
Cool. Thanks for having this conversation with me. This idea occurred to me. This linkage seems so important and critical to me, and it seemed like you would be a great person to have the conversation with. So, I know for me, I cut my teeth in community organizing as a young person in high school, really, when the Afghanistan war and then the Iraq war was beginning. So that was sort of an entry for me in some ways to engaging with community issues, and so I was wondering if you could just speak briefly to what you see as the connections between anti-war work and work to defend the planet.
Well, I think one of the more immediate perspectives that come to mind with the links between anti-war activism and activism related to saving the natural world, saving wild nature, is just trying to make the connection between occupation and for me, I think the most basic statement is, what we're looking at is that our culture, we live in a culture of occupation, and that is what we are. I think from the very first moment one enters the military, the very first moment that you are, putting on the uniform and you are forming up for basic training, you understand that your life is going to be occupied by aggressive and violent force. I mean, technically speaking, they're not supposed to be violent towards you during basic training, but you will experience a kind of psychological breakdown. And that's the whole point. As a matter of fact, the first phase of Army basic training that all recruits go through is called Red Phase, and they call it total control. That is the philosophy behind the first phase of basic training. It's total control, it's domination, it's breaking down the recruit's ego so that they become compliant to orders. And so when we look at what's happening to the natural world, is that we live in a culture that is occupying more and more land, that occupies, the rights to the land. A culture that is led by industry, that's led by militarism, that's led by capitalism, a culture that occupies the land and uses it as resources. I think the connections are pretty obvious there.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. And it seems to me like it's very directly, the links are so direct in so many ways. I think the issues are really inseparable, and so to me it's almost silly that there are multiple different social movements that we differentiate between the social movements to defend the planet and to fight war and imperialism, because it seems to me that the primary justification for most war is resource extraction. And there may be other justifications that we hear about, that those in power use to try and get people on board make the war seem acceptable. But whether you're talking about Iraq with huge oil reserves or Afghanistan with all the trillions of dollars of mineral wealth that they want to extract from Afghanistan, or the colonization of this continent of North America, what's now called North America, the primary motivation in all those wars of occupation and takeover was get control of the natural resources and turn those into wealth. And one of the really interesting things to me too is in preparing for this conversation, I was just thinking about how far this goes back into history and thinking about the Roman Empire and how they deforested much of the Middle East and North Africa in order to build their navies, and destroying old-growth forests to the point that it still has not recovered to this day, thousands of years later. And that has a lot of parallels with things that the U.S. military is doing, contemporary days, whether that's, the poisoning of Fallujah or the nuclear tests in Nevada or, the poisoning of Hanford in the Columbia River. It seems to me that there's a direct line and direct connection between these imperialist forces just decimating the land in order to get power and wealth in the past all the way up to today.
I absolutely agree. And one of the things that strikes me in hearing your excellent articulation of this is all of the different projects that organizations around the world are doing to clean up the messes of a militaristic and occupation-based culture. I'm thinking of, for instance, Project Renew in Vietnam. A group of local Vietnamese citizens and U.S. military veterans that clean up unexploded ordnances and supply services to the people there who continue to suffer from unexploded ordnances and Agent Orange poisoning. And so, we look at all of these different examples around the world. There are so many different links. I mean, yes, I agree that the primary motivation for most military actions is to facilitate resource extraction. That's absolutely true. And in the cases when it seems the political domination is more prominent than seeking resources, there is still a resource to be extracted in the area. Inevitably, one way or another, whether it's the labor of the people or whether it's something they can pull from the land base. That's always true. And, there are overlapping motivations behind most of these military actions. We don't even know every day, where the United States is sending missile strikes and covert operations. I mean, we don't even find out sometimes till decades later of these operations. These things are happening all the time. And we live in a culture that normalizes it, that, justifies it from the perspective of, protecting our freedoms or our liberty or our sovereignty or, spreading democracy and things like this. But really, it's just a way to concentrate a population's resources into exerting domination and control around the world. And, we're the biggest carbon producer in history. This country, the United States, is the biggest producer of carbon pollution in history. And it's just mass madness to think that we can continue to make decisions that, basically close the door on further options. That the decisions that really narrow our options to protect the land base. And so, such as pulling out of Paris climate agreement. And it's not as if that's not a symbolic act in the first place, but it's just testament to how a land-based resources can be put to the use of imperialism and domination. very easily around the world.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like the examples could just go on and on. You're saying the U.S. is the historically biggest carbon emitter, and of course the military makes up the largest portion of that. The single entity that produces the most carbon emissions worldwide in terms of businesses or organizations is the U.S. military, and and then you can scale that down and look at the small scale what they're doing. Some friends of mine are organizers down in Nevada, and they've been fighting the Air Force wants to expand the Nellis Air Force Base, the bombing range, into the Desert National Wildlife Refuge, which is this beautiful desert area where there are bighorn sheep, and it's really an important place for wildlife, very remote, very wild, and pretty untouched, and north of Las Vegas. And the Air Force wants to start bombing that area. And, of course, they're already bombing a huge portion of southern Nevada and northern Nevada and various other places in the country. But, the stories just go on and on in terms of how this destruction happens. And it seems to me that just once you have that mindset once you have the mindset of a colonizer, of an occupier, of an imperialist, then you can really justify a lot. And I was reading some things that our mutual friend Doug Zachary wrote, and he was talking about Vietnam and about the rape of women during Vietnam, and the interconnections between militarism and patriarchy. And it seems to me that this sort of violation imperative, this entitlement, this might makes right sort of hypothesis, has become so ingrained in U.S. culture in general, in military culture in particular, in patriarchy, that it just creates this sort of circular situation where it's spiraling worse. Militarism, patriarchy, environmental destruction, just spiraling down towards doom, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to think about those interconnections, and doom is right. I don't think that's far off. But I do think that you're absolutely right, and I find myself thinking about my experiences in basic training, and then subsequently National Guard infantry training, where we run these mock military operations, and we get to try out all of the advanced weapon systems, things like that, at least from ground warfare perspective, and we run these drills that are meant to basically again train us how to be an occupying force. And like I said, the training itself is both it's physical and psychological. Physically speaking, you have to be in your top condition to be an effective soldier. But at the same time, your mind has to be ready to and willing to take orders. And the idea that we have the ability to disobey an unlawful order, it's just not always the case on the battlefield. There's obvious, environmental conditions, and just the sake of wanting to stay alive and wanting your squad to get out of the battle alive, sometimes you just take orders, and you, in any case, are trained to do that. So it's not as if you have the moment of mind in that moment to make a decision not to follow an unlawful order, or at least have time to think about it when you're being shot at. I mean, I did not deploy to war. Fortunately, I was not involved in actual combat, but the simulated exercises that I undertook were real to me, and I got a little bit of a taste of what that's like. And so when you look at the larger culture, you look at the culture that males are growing up in. We're growing up in a culture that values violence, domination, and control, and really values males, um, frowning and sort of acting against analysis, acting against introspection, acting against contemplation. Males are not encouraged to be contemplative. Males are not encouraged to be introspective. Males are encouraged to simply be selfish and seek gain, seek power and status. Males are essentially told that that masculinity and manhood is either a chivalrous perspective of protecting women or a misogynist perspective of dominating women. Those are the choices that males are given in this culture. We see it in the media, we see it in movies, we see it in video games, we see it everywhere. Males are not, there are no competing messages in this culture other than piecemeal platitudes to human dignity. But in terms of messages that specifically target males, trying to get men to give up a violent perspective of life, there are none of those competing messages in the larger culture. The larger culture gives males a very narrow perspective, that is domination, power of women, of the planet. And so these parallels are very clear. The male has a body that can be put to the use of violence, of a dominating system. We have the kind of body that can be used as a resource to dominate women and dominate planet. We can put an individual human being's inner resources to that purpose. That's the reason why the military is experimenting with mindfulness training of soldiers right now. Mindfulness is an inner resource that can be put to the use of violence when you want to achieve that aim. And so we look at this as like, we can try our best to appeal to the inner dignity and inner sense of right and wrong in a person. But when the messages are so narrow and so dominant, we have to try other tactics to get through to men. And I think the radical feminist perspective is that tactic. So.
Right. Yeah, I resonate with a lot of that. My father was in the military, thankfully briefly, but he talks about the basic training and how horrible it was, how they just basically are trying to break you down and break your spirit so that you'll do what you're told, so that you'll follow orders. And the other thing that was coming to mind was just objectification. It seems like objectifying the enemy, objectifying women, objectifying the non-human world, objectifying mountains and rivers and grasslands is a necessary prerequisite to getting human beings to commit atrocities. And it seems to me like most of this culture is dedicated towards getting people to objectify the world, objectify women, objectify other people in various ways, and the result is this situation that we're in that's so dire. And the other thing that came to mind is the news broke this week, as you may have seen, about the military contractor Tiger Swan working out on the Dakota Access Pipeline. They were the group that was hired by the Dakota Access company to monitor and surveil the resistance, the water protectors camp, and they were flying drones and planes over the camps. They had infiltrators inside the camps. They were embedded with the police and the operations the police were doing out there, and it was quite stunning. And the report that was leaked from Tiger Swan used the language of insurgency, which I thought was very interesting. It said this is an insurgent movement to stop the pipeline. And so, of course, then they start, the logical response is you use counterinsurgency tactics. And to me, it's this really interesting dovetail between, what happened in Iraq, for example, what continues to happen there, and what's happening here. Because, I of course, the situation in Iraq and anywhere else is complicated. Nothing's simple in the world. And, there are religious fundamentalists over in Iraq, just like there are religious fundamentalists here who have really awful, reprehensible politics and are willing to do terrible, terrible things to achieve their goals. And with that said, I think a lot of the Iraqi resistance was more concerned with getting the occupying force out of their homeland so they could simply live in peace than they were with, implementing a very right-wing, retrograde religious ideology. So it's interesting to me to think about those parallels, and it sort of gets to the point of strategy for me. And I don't have the answers. I don't think anyone necessarily has the answers, because we're up against a system that's massive. It's very wealthy. It's ingrained. It's hundreds and thousands of years old, and we're fighting a lot. But I do think that a lot of people are on the side of justice. We just don't have the resources. We don't have the organization. We don't have what we need to win. And so it brings up those questions of strategy for me. And I'm wondering if you can share any thoughts you have on strategy for the anti-war movement, strategy for the environmental movement, strategy for justice work and fighting patriarchy in general, and what you see as some effective ways to build movement and build momentum for the long term.
Well, I appreciate you asking me and valuing my perspectives. Thank you. And I would say I don't necessarily have the answers either. I struggle with the same questions. I find myself, a member of very different organizations in terms of strategy. I mean, in terms of like world vision, and in terms of underlying fundamental values, I think that the work that I do in all of my various capacities complement each other. But I think I think movements do struggle over tactics and do struggle over strategy, and even struggle over what is the real scale of the problem. And that's something that I've been talking and writing about for a while, and it's something that's really valuable to me to consider, because I think largely my work in the radical environmental movement, our presentations, our writings, so often are just trying to get people to understand the real scope of the destruction, and even trying to show what has been hidden for so long, and uncover connections that were already there. So it's sometimes that seems like an uphill battle. Sometimes I think people either just don't know because of lack of information, or they don't want to know for very good reasons. Those of us who are not afraid to face the reality of the destruction and violence, we live lives that can oftentimes be very stressful, because we know these things, and we feel compelled to act, and we feel compelled to help out when we can, or when we feel moved to, and because the problem is so urgent. So I value everyone's perspective in terms of what can be done. I do want to say that I don't necessarily think I have to agree with every tactic out there, or necessarily have to agree that we all have to follow one tactic. And unfortunately, I think many movements in the mainstream portion of the social justice movement do participate in that kind of practice, and I disagree with that. I don't necessarily think that the entire movement has to stick to nonviolence. or that the entire movement has to stick to pacifist ideology. And let's just be real now, in case anyone has some reservations about that. Dr. Martin Luther King himself wrote that he finds it paternalistic for instance, the white man to preach patience and to tell the Negro to wait. He says he finds that the white person who preaches wait and preaches patience can sometimes be more insidious than the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner. These are his words, and so even though he was a strict nonviolent activist, of course, in terms of his activism, he was not a pacifist, and he was not trying to dictate the movements, the actions of an entire movement. The truth is that there are a diversity of tactics, and sometimes communities find themselves in a very dire situation, and the option is not always stick to pacifist nonviolence and watch everyone get their asses kicked. That's not always an option. Like, I am not afraid to say that I'm willing to protect my family and my loved ones. I think that is an important thing, not because I necessarily think that everybody has the physical capacity to do that, because not everybody does. But I think the sentiment is fairly obvious to understand, and sometimes we don't want to watch our loved ones or our land base be destroyed. Sometimes we don't want to sit back and watch that happen. Sometimes the only thing that's going to stop it is some kind of force. And nonviolence can be forceful. It can be persuasive. It can force the hand of the state, so to speak, in many different ways. I think we need to be smart about how we employ our tactics. But I think at the very least, because I find myself in the peace movement. I strive to be a peaceful person. I don't want to commit acts of violence. I really don't. Just personally speaking. But I think we at the very least need to find ways to be effective, no matter what tactics we use. Effectiveness is what's important. We need the violence to stop. We need the destruction to stop, and we don't have much time to find a way to stop it. Those are really important points for any movement to understand, regardless of the tactics that you employ. And obviously, this is theory and strategy that's been laid out in many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to me like that's one of the valuable things about having this conversation is that I think the environmental movement or what's called the environmental movement can bring an interesting and important perspective to the table in terms of long-term decline, in terms of urgency, in terms of connections between colonization and so on, and that the anti-war movement can bring in a really important perspective, just in the sense that I think there's a recognition in the anti-war movement, in the anti-imperialist movement, that we are in a war, and it's not our choice that we're in that war. That war has been brought to us. It's been forced on us. And living here in the U.S., we're on the fringes of that war. I mean, you as a black man are closer to the center of that war than I am. But people who are living in Iraq and in Yemen and in Somalia and Syria and many other places around the world are much closer to the front lines of that war and are experiencing it on a different level. And I appreciate what you were saying about force, because I think that once you recognize that we are in a war, then the questions become a lot less about how do we change everyone's consciousness, and much more about how do we win this battle that we're in. And yeah, like you said, with the understanding that we are peaceful people, we don't want to fight, but if you're forced to fight, it's not a good idea to deny the fact that you are in a fight and pretend that it isn't happening. I think that's a path toward losing, and we can't afford it, even though it's really horrible that we're in this situation. And I appreciate what you said about that nonviolence can be very forceful. It seems to me like often it's not in the way that it's used. And I learned recently about a big action that took place in 1971 for May Day in Washington, D.C. And there were thousands and thousands of people who showed up in D.C. With the goal of shutting down the entire federal government. And they decided they were going to blockade all the major intersections. They were going to blockade federal buildings, and they were going to try and do this all in a mobile way. So the point wasn't to get arrested. The point was actually to shut it down. So they did things like strategically running out of gas in major intersections, or dragging barricades out into the streets and so on. And it actually didn't end up working very well because it was big public action. Hard to keep that sort of thing secret with thousands of people involved. So the National Guard was called in. It was one of the largest police actions in U.S. history, the largest mass arrests in U.S. history. Thousands, I think something like 7,000 people arrested in 2 or 3 days. But what I find pretty inspiring about it is that it scared the shit out of the administration. And they said things like, this is a real threat. And it was an action that had teeth, and it really had strong teeth, sharp teeth. And that's inspiring to me, learning that history. And of course there's a lot of history of inspiring movements and movements that have represented real threats that I think we can learn from and innovate based on for the future.
I really love that example that you gave of that protest. That's a really clear way of showing what it takes to build a forceful movement using tactics that are actually available to that populace. And that's always an important thing to consider. Or what are the resources that a movement can put to its use, to achieve its goals. And I really like what you said about the anti-war movement being able to bring a sense of the war, what the war is and what it's like for communities around the world. And another thing I was thinking of as far as contributions from the anti-war movement is a sense of discipline. And there, I'm always careful about using the term discipline in terms of like what its relationship to masculinity, of course. But I will say that there is an important aspect of having a trained populace, having a group of people who know what it's like to put their bodies on the line for a particular cause, and people who are capable of really going there for their community if it's necessary. If they find themselves in a real war, or really under threat, really under physical assault, like we saw at Standing Rock, or like we saw, you see it pretty much everywhere. And so I would definitely say that there is, very good contributions that the anti-war movement can make if we can find ways for the movements to communicate with each other and to be open to collaboration and to have honest conversations and just find points of unity between activists, between individuals, between organizations, because there are many ways that we can be really effective in showing a particular stance and a particular message, which is all of these things are connected. And it's something that Veterans for Peace has been doing much better these days, I think. I mean, we have much more social media, much more presence at different activist events around the country and around the world, and we, display a message of, stop the war on Mother Earth. The U.S. military, biggest polluter in the world. We have messages like that on our banners. Our publications often speak about the environmental cost of war. So we're trying to show a sense of these connections within the peace movement. And I think, again, regardless of the tactics that our movements employ, there are ways that we can work with each other and find points of unity so that we can be more effective. We can see our goals actually being met, as opposed to constantly being met with defeat and sadness and despair. So I think these things are really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I hear a lot of that, and I think, I've learned a lot as as an organizer from sort of having toes over the years in many different movements. I've learned a lot from being involved in anti-racist work and learning about my own privilege and how internalized oppression plays out and how, racism is used to divide us and to, exploit and extract from people of color in this country and abroad, and to make that acceptable via objectification. And I've learned a lot from the feminist movement and just how it can completely destroy movements to have masculinity and patriarchy, inside these movements that are supposedly for justice, and it can just sort of rip the heart out of, movements by making it almost impossible for women to participate and take leadership and feel valued and feel honored and just introduce these sort of toxic patriarchal values into organizing spaces. And I've learned so much from the anti-war movement in terms of the things that we've been talking about and the environmental movement, And yeah, I really think we need to blend all these things together, learn from each other, and bring the best pieces together. One of my big frustrations with the environmental movement is just how sometimes it gets turned into this sort of feel-good, upper class, middle class phenomenon where it's all about buying organic food and driving an electric car, and when you put that in the context of the anti-war movement and the fact that this is an occupation that we're fighting, it's a global imperialist crusade that we're fighting, it becomes ridiculous, those sort of false solutions. And so I really think that sort of understanding is very valuable, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you. So I know we better wrap up here because you got to go, but do you have any closing thoughts or anything you want to say before we wire this up? Kourtney, you there? You might be muted.
Hi, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
I wanted to say that I totally agree with you in terms of the lessons from the feminist movement regarding how masculinity and patriarchy within organizations can really rip apart an organization. And Veterans for Peace certainly continues to struggle with that in many different ways. And there are many women within Veterans for Peace who continue to hold us accountable for the ways that we may have failed in that regard to address masculinity and patriarchy within our organization. And I'm deeply appreciative of the members who continue to do that because they, want to see Veterans for Peace succeed, and they don't want to continue to see suffering among the women in the organization. And so I will say that I'm happy to be a part of an organization and be a part of a board that would agree with me on that, and that would actually back me up on that and not try to silence me in saying that. So I think that's a good thing for us, and that we continue to try. And as a matter of fact, we're taking steps right now to do that in some very concrete ways. But I will say that I totally agree with that perspective, and it's like one of the most basic things that any man within any social justice or progressive movement or peace movement or wherever you find yourself can continue to think about is the value of introspection, the value of contemplation, and the value of looking at what masculinity really is, looking at what it actually means to live your life according to a code of ethics that's based on domination and control, and to question these ideas of healthy masculinity, and to actually look at what masculinity actually is, and look at what femininity is. That's the radical perspective that I think all of us can start with to be more effective and to, take up a practice that allows the space for organizations to address these issues. You know, we have to start there and be willing to have those difficult conversations, you know, which again is something our board is doing. But I welcome all the perspectives, you know, when they're in the room, and I'm willing to talk with everyone. I'm willing to have those difficult conversations and not let our disagreements prevent us from working together. So I think that's just really important. We need to have a greater presence because of these overarching issues that continue to get worse. Our movements need to have a greater presence in the larger national conversations. We need to be there. We can't continue to have our own niche in the culture. We need to have a greater effect. And so I think that's the way we can do that. So I really appreciate you having me, Max, and I just love talking with you about these issues, and I really value your perspective. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely, Kourtney. Thanks for taking time out this morning. I know it's pretty early for both of us, but you're always so brilliant, and I love hearing your perspective, so we should definitely get together and do this again.
I absolutely would love that.
Okay. Well, take care, Kourtney, and we'll talk more soon.
Absolutely. You take care, too.
Thanks. Bye.